Okay, let's start. It's really a pleasure to have Maria Leptin here. So as many of you know, I think she's been colleague scientist of many of us that are here. Maria started as an immunologist and developmental biologist. And besides being a scientist, she was also head of EMBO for a while and is now president of the ERC. And she really holds a very important job and was already holding for all of us here. And I think the ERC, for many of us, and in particular, talking from my position of being a researcher in Portugal, the ERC has really been an example of an institution setting the model for evaluation, how panels should work, how evaluation should work. And I think it's really nice that it's not just about the funding that it gives out, but also about the methodologies that it uses, that it can be also on the forefront, on the future of taking new ways of doing research and funding research and setting new behavior in research. So thank you very much for being here, Maria, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, EU Life, for having me here. Now, I have to warn you, there is no way I can be as inspiring and amazing as the talks we've heard so far, or as original and quick and intelligent as the competition winners we just saw. I'll do my best. So I was told by Giulio to think of utopia, to dream. And when we had a conversation, I sort of said, yes, well, so, if I look back, he said, you may not look back. So I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm afraid I have to. So obviously I could comment here about the future of discovery-driven research from the institutional perspective. As the ERC president, that's why I'm here. But I could also look at it from a very personal perspective. And since my views are, of course, formed by my own history and by my own personal experience, I'll begin with that. So I noticed recently when I heard a bunch of young people, maybe they weren't young, I can't remember, talking about who they worked for, I sort of thought, that is not something that's ever applied to me in my whole life. I'm 68 still, and I've never worked for anybody, except when I was a waitress in a restaurant, in my whole life. And I think that's important. So it didn't apply to me during my PhD. I chose my own project. My advisor was frequently away. He was a good advisor when he was there. And we enjoyed talking to each other, not as a postdoc. I was in Cambridge at the LMB in a very small research group, totally independent, published single author papers. And then, of course, once you're an independent group leader and a professor, you're independent anyway. So always independent, always free. And I think that is something that, if it still exists, has to be maintained in the future, and says something about institutes. I'll get to that in a moment. I also want to stress that this does not mean that I was sort of autistically living in a bubble. For example, in the last 10 or 12 years, when I had a lab at EMBL, I struck up the most wonderful collaborations, not because we were forced to collaborate, not because they were collaborative programs, but just because we interacted, talked to each other, were struck by each other's science, and teamed up. And so that says to me that the research environment matters. And I want to get back to my PhD institute. In fact, it's a shame that Antonio Coutinho can't be here with us today, because he and I were actually going to write up an article about that institute. He too was there, the Basel Institute of Immunology, because we think of it as an ideal institute. It was 50 researchers, independent researchers. Each had a technician, each had a lab, and it was a privately funded institute by Hoffmann-La Roche at the time. Unlimited money. Literally unlimited money. The sky was the limit. You asked for it, you got it. And it had a fantastic infrastructure, mouse facilities, all biochemical facilities, media, everything was done. So, and they were 50 independent people. Some of them had a couple of postdocs, very few. The Nobel Prize winners did, and some had students. There were 3 students. So again, that environment meant everybody creatively talked to each other all the time. So that's how my career has formed me. I believe strongly in independence and independent interactions. Now, the ERC wants to fund original, independent, creative, original projects. Some say high risk, high gain. We've struck that. Breakthrough, all these things. That's the aim of the ERC, to fund such projects made by people who have the capacity to carry these out. So ideally, ERC grants are supposed to help create the conditions of freedom and independence that I just described, and thereby hopefully enable the next Humboldt, the next Galileo, the next Leonardo we heard earlier today. And that would be great, of course. So one question we could ask about the future is, does the ERC, is that the right mechanism to fund people and to identify the right people? I think the answer could probably be yes. Mechanism, the money that ERC grantees give and the fact that these are independent grants and their very own does give them freedom and independence. Especially the younger people, of course, get very independent of institutional structures if they have their own money at that level. Do we fund the right people? I guess I could quote data that show that we do. They do well. They win Nobel Prizes, register patents, publish good papers, etc. But we heard from Alex this morning, or this afternoon, Alex Jordan, that perhaps production is the completely wrong metrics. And so if we take that metric, then okay, but maybe that's not right. So I'm not going to claim anything. And of course, all this is no proof that we've been doing the selection right. In fact, there's always the need to be self-critical, especially in an organization that claims excellence as its core value. And so after I arrived there, we did an exercise of self-criticism, and we've looked at the way the ERC assesses projects and people, and we've made some changes. They will soon be published. They've already been talked about. I'll be happy to talk about that later, but I think that's not so much for now. So briefly, the conditions that are necessary. What does good science need if we don't have artists who inspire us and build spiderwebs in museums? There's nothing very much that the ERC can do to foster structures in institutions that provide the right environment. When I was EMBO director, I asked our sort of most prestigious clientele, the young investigators, what they think mattered most to them. There's a very small number of people every year, 20 or so life scientists who've started the lab within the last 4 years, I believe. So they're really leading young scientists. What do you need? And they came back with a really highly consensual position on what they needed. Good infrastructure. So, give us the machines, give us the media kitchen, give us the assistance, or as in one of the utopias, the grant writing office, the bureaucracy office, so you don't have to do any of that. That was important. They really liked a critical environment. They said, we want critique. We don't dislike writing grants. We don't dislike writing papers. We don't dislike giving seminars. It's all good if our colleagues are mega critical, because that brings creativity. And then they said longer term funding. And I'm citing this because there are some funders here and there are some heads of institutions here who can make a change. They said the competition for grants is not a problem. Writing a grant makes you think creatively. But if you have to do it every 2 years and then get, one PhD fellowship and 5,000 euros consumables, you spend all your time writing, and in between time, somebody has to assess and evaluate all those. So that has to stop too. So So one thing to do is to give longer-term funding. And I mean, 5 years is fine. The Wellcome Trust has just gone to 8 years. Clearly, 2 to 3 year grants are not good, so too bad the minister isn't here, but pass it on to her or anyone else who sits here. I think longer-term funding will make for better science, will allow people to take more risks, allow people to be more creative. So let's assume that institutions do provide a good environment, and say ERC funding enables the most original and exciting projects to be carried out in these environments. Is that sufficient? The ERC actually provides only 3% of the total public research spending in Europe. So is that enough? Would it be enough if that was it? Or maybe if we do manage, is Manuel still here? I think so, yes. If we do manage, and I was glad to hear your optimistic tones this afternoon, if we do manage to get the research funding doubled of the next Horizon program, the next framework program, is that what we should rely on? I think not, and I want to say something very unpopular here. I want to speak in praise of something that is normally used as a derogatory term, and that is incremental research. So the ERC funds 3%, those who are good and lucky enough, there's a lot of luck involved in getting those grants, may do very well. They may make breakthrough discoveries. They may be the fount of future inventors, future patents, etc. But they really need all the work that's being done, the I's dotted, the T's crossed. All the other labs who don't perhaps have the luxury of even getting to the point where they can apply for those grants, who train the next generation of students. You never know where the next brilliant mind comes from. It doesn't need to be from the big centers. So I think we need the incremental research as well. And that means we also need the researchers that do that research. So if we think about the future, if we think about a utopia of the institutes that we've heard, we have to remember that there are all sorts of people wanting to do research. There are people who do want to go out and have an idea and not listen to their colleagues who tell them they're harebrained or crazy or too risky, or they're not going to get their tenure if they try that, and do it anyway. But there are also those who like to do safe research. Maybe they actually don't want to go out on a limb. And I think we need them all. And we've been hearing a lot about inclusion, which often refers to including enough females. I'm really happy to see so many here today. I think, especially in Portugal, that's actually not a problem at all. Or ethnic groups, or all sorts. Socioeconomic, I think, is very important, and it's one of the hardest. So we talk about inclusion, which means enabling a wider range of people to participate in their research. But that's participate in the research the way we do it now. So Robert Dijkgraaf, science minister in Netherlands, also a scientist, former president of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, so very open-minded. He said he doesn't want to talk about inclusion anymore. He wants to talk, he called it expansion, that term was not liked. But what he wanted to point out is we don't necessarily want to make more people fit the mold that we, the older generation, have made and in which we were successful. But maybe we want to change the mold. Maybe we want to be more accommodating to different ways of doing research. We may simply need more pluralism. We could allow people to do half-time research. We could allow them to do amateur research. Some amateurs in history have done extremely well and discovered interesting things. They're not burdened down by some things that somebody quite rightly said us old folks are. We may want to engage citizens. That's very popular. Children, perhaps. And those are not just silly ideas. There are wonderful examples of exactly that happening. One example is in the Netherlands, where, and I for neither of these examples can I remember the two researcher names, but I'll just give you the example. A project in monitoring air pollution. And what the research group did, it gave as many people as wanted an app and a camera for their iPhone and asked them at certain times of day just to point the camera at the sky. And they had a mechanism of measuring what was in the sky. And with this, and got a whole lot of people, just, you don't have to do it every day, all the time, but if enough people do it reasonably frequently, they got a map of the air quality over Holland that was massively more detailed and massively more up-to-date than those that are measured by satellites. So everybody participated. And the good thing is people learn about science, people learn about controls, people learn about the scientific method, which I think is sorely necessary. Another, I mentioned children, is a project in population monitoring of jungle animals, where again it's iPhone-based, where young teenagers and children who regularly spend time in the jungle were given cameras. They're attuned to seeing animals. They're much better at seeing animals in the jungle, their own world, than we are. And they were just trained to take photographs and then fill in certain number of boxes about these animals, which were centrally collected. So really a crowdsourcing of real science data. So it can be done. And maybe that's what we should do, broaden the mold, have ways for everybody to do science in the way they want to and in which they can contribute. So, I don't know, how do we do better? That's where I fail completely. I do like the idea that better architecture helps, that better spaces for being together help. I mentioned my PhD institute with a central cafeteria where a lot of exchange happened, better infrastructure. But we also have to remember a slightly painful truth, and that is that in fields like the life sciences, and that's what we're talking about today, with heavy and expensive and fast evolving research infrastructures, we have to have different tiers of researchers. Not every institute can have a suite of 30 microscopes with all the different top-level specifications that also get adapted every year. So not everybody can have access to these. We have to recognize that different kinds of science will need to be done in different places. And for that alone, I'm afraid competition, for that reason alone, competition, much as we would like to see it gone, cannot so easily disappear. What can disappear, I think, are hierarchies. For them to go away, we don't need to be utopian. Give people more independence and less power of researchers over other researchers. Models exist. Again, I mentioned my PhD institute. People have written about small is beautiful. Some institutions limit the size of their research groups. So I think what we'll have to do in the future to make it a better future is define and support all sorts of different ways of contributing to science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have time for some questions. At the back. Is it Erin? Shout.
I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you. Barely, but yes. I could repeat also.
Hi, everyone. So I'll frame the context of this. I am Erin Tranfield. I run the electron microscopy core facility here at the Gulbenkian. We are the only EM core facility really in Portugal that does what we do. So now coming back to your question, Maria, about the infrastructure. I would love to say that our core facility is actually a great model, that although we're nested within the Gulbenkian, we can actually provide service for people all over the country. But one thing we struggle here with is how to get that primary investment to get the infrastructure. So I guess my question for you, or maybe for Manuel, would be, as the research landscape evolves, as infrastructures get more complex and more equipment is more expensive, do you think there will be EU initiatives to do centralized microscopy or technical facilities within research countries?
Well, there are the ESFRIs, right? There are the, what does ESFRI stand for? Research infrastructures, which are countries combining to create those infrastructures to be used throughout Europe. I mean, some of the ITs, bioinformatics infrastructures, of course, exist. There's, again, at EMBL, new microscopy infrastructure. But you're right, it might not be a bad idea to have central funding for that. Good point.
Thank you.
Maria, really great points. And following up on that last, I was sort of sitting here thinking, all these research institutes that are represented here represent huge resources for local university communities. And one of the things that having just been head of a division in the university, encouraging collaboration and use of those facilities through universities, plus all the undergraduate resources and crowdsourcing projects through them, would be a really positive thing to support and really make those resources available.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think sharing resources is important. Sometimes the other thing that one of our writers ditched for his utopia, the ego, of course, stands in that way. Stands in the way of that. But sure, I see it in the city where I'm professor in Cologne, that the Max Planck Institutes and the universities, for example, Max Planck Institutes, very well endowed, share very freely. But it depends on the individual scientists on both sides talking to each other. So again, it needs an environment of openness towards each other. Joe has a question.
Yes, thank you. So we are, of course, big supporters of the ERC, as you know. We believe that the value of ERC goes far beyond the 3% research money distributed or invested by ERC. So we've been advocating with EU Life for a long time already that money in Europe should be spent much more on the lower TRLs than on the bigger TRLs. And the only thing we see is that framework program after framework program, it moves further up in the TRLs. We understand, of course, that the politicians at European level want to see more translation, want to see more innovations, want to see more knowledge and science translated into practice, into applications. But it can never, be applied if there is not a big pipeline of new stuff coming.
Totally agree.
Well, what can we do? I consider personally 3% as incremental.
Yeah.
So what can we do to raise that budget for ERC?
Okay. Where shall I start? By the way, TRL is, you said you don't know your way around Europe. Anybody who uses the term TRL knows. It's technology readiness level, a term that even those who invented it no longer like. Anyway, so just by way of explanation, what can you do? So we will be, lots of institutions are putting out statements, Coimbra Group, Alia, Leroux, you name it, they're all making statements. Ultimately, it's the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council who decide. So, lobby your politicians, your parliamentarians, your president, your finance minister, your foreign minister. It's those who sit together and decide. Now, I will go out and not fight for the ERC itself. I will go out and fight for all science funding, because we're doing quite well in Europe. We have the European Innovation Council that was introduced with the last framework program. I think the ratio should definitely not shift away from basic research. The ERC gets only 17%. I could easily double that. and we would not waste a penny. We have enough projects that could be funded if we funded twice as many. There's enough evidence that we'd not be wasting money. Also, of the so-called transition grants that are awarded by the EIC, good half are former ERC grantees. The ERC, even though it's not there to register patents, per dollar does as good as those projects that fund applied research. So the evidence is infinite that we need the fundamental science, and the fundamental science does extremely well at feeding the innovation, at feeding translation. And all of that, somebody else mentioned it earlier today, all that feeds into general wealth and all this competition we're talking about. What are we talking about? A Green Deal and competition with the outside world and clean energy. It all comes from fundamental research. I mean, this is obvious here, but the finance ministers, foreign ministers, and heads of state need to know, and your parliamentarians need to know.
Thank you. We will work on that.
Please. That's my question.
Any more questions? Okay.
I work at the Friedrich Institute in Switzerland, in Basel, Switzerland. And as you know, Switzerland dropped out of the ERC funding scheme about 2 years ago. This is really bad for us, and now we start feeling the negative consequences. And I was just wondering how you feel about this, whether this is still a topic for you,
Yes.
whether you feel that
bad.
something can be done about it.
Bad. I feel bad about it. Everyone else I talk to feels bad about it. Everybody at the ERC feels bad about it. All the research community in Europe feels bad about it. We need UK, we need Switzerland. We are one big community, and to split that community up is insane. Now, it has political reasons, and I frequently talk to the science minister in Switzerland. She's working hard to try and get association possible again. It's at a higher political level, but things are moving. So exploratory talks towards association will hopefully start soon.
Maria, related to your comments around inclusion, I'd really love to hear about how you think we might be able to judge scientific excellence that isn't about the sort of people who are in a privileged position to be highly productive, and also, as we heard from the essayists earlier, that are able to really tell a good story.
Yeah.
So how do we actually measure that? And then kind of related to that, actually judging science is really time-consuming, but yet we don't actually reward or recognize people who do that really important job of reviewing others' science, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So we have included a box where people can list and are encouraged to list what services they provide to the community. Now, when it comes to awarding grants, we would prefer to reward good citizenship. But ultimately, of course, we're supposed to be funding the best possible idea. I think when it comes to hiring colleagues, that's a completely different dimension, and all these things can actually be taken into account big time. We take them into account, but it will never make up for a weak project. So how do you measure? Well, that is the million-dollar question. And the trouble, I mentioned socioeconomic and also ethnic. Of course, the trouble is that by the time you're at the level where you can apply for a grant at this level, it's too late. It has to start in school. So, those people from less privileged backgrounds, some of them come through, but if we want them to do better, it'll have to start much younger, as does science training. Maybe some of these citizen projects will rope in people. But again, I think, and socioeconomic, we can't even see. We can't even see. Ethnic, we often can't see.
So I actually have a slightly provocative question, which is
Please.
not referred to ERC. It's been a wonderful and inspiring afternoon where one of the most common kind of term were fundamental research. and how to support creativity, imagination, founding. And then you look at it, and it kind of clashes with what is happening in science, really, where fundamental research is less and less funded, and we have a great example of amazing institute of fundamental research which are actually closing down. So how can we do to, as a scientist, to reverse this?
Talk. Explain the value of fundamental research. I think there is, I don't think it's quite that dire. I mean, first of all, you also need creativity, originality, breakthrough style thinking to do applied research. The ERC funds engineers and it funds medical research. So I think that dichotomy doesn't exist. And that research can be fun and inspiring and you know, amazing. So I think talent is everywhere. But you're right, we have to make it, it will stop if the basic research is no longer funded. Explain. The funny thing is, you know, so when I give a different talk, not preaching to the converted who are sitting in this room, I remind people that actually we're not even talking about research that might one day lead to a cure or deal with climate change. We fund research that is pure curiosity without anything. Some of it even in high tech, like the black hole. You know, the black hole that was discovered a couple of years ago and then the second one this year, front page news. It does nothing for us. It's just a black hole and we are amazed and we love it. It doesn't cure cancer and it doesn't make clean water, it doesn't solve. So people have to remember that too, that, you know, curiosity-driven research is a cultural good and that has to be protected.
Thank you very much, Maria.